Okay, welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to have everyone here. My name is Eric Patashnik, and I am the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy here at the Watson School. It's my pleasure tonight to be joined in conversation with Kathy Manning. Kathy, as many of you know, is a senior fellow here at the Watson School. She's teaching a short course or a study group on Congress, the Good, Bad, and the Ugly. She served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2021 to 2025, representing North Carolina's 6th Congressional District. She was vice-ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, vice chair of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, and served on the Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organization, as well as other roles. Prior to her congressional service, she was a partner in a major law firm specializing in general litigation and immigration before founding her own immigration law firm. And so what we thought we would do tonight is really have a conversation to try to talk about what is happening in Washington. Why is the government shut down? What are the dynamics that are shaping the current conflict? What are the implications for real citizens, for people around the country, for government, and how our democracy works? Before we begin our conversation, I did want to make a public service announcement, and it's quite fitting given what's happening in Washington, and that is to let everyone here know that the Watson School is beginning organizing a donation drive to support the Rhode Island Community Food Bank. There's an opportunity to drop off food at the reception desk here at the Watson School 111 Fair. Some of the suggested items include cereal, peanut butter, canned fruit, canned vegetables, mac and cheese, pasta and sauces, rice, canned soup, beans and lentils, tomato products, and spices and condiments. And the Watson School will also be facilitating donations to the Rhode Island Community Food Bank. So it's an important cause. And if you have any questions about it, just ask at the reception desk. Okay, so to begin, where are we? So we are at November 3rd is the 34th day of the federal government shutdown. We're now beginning its second month. This began in October 1, and it's already the second largest government shutdown, and it's quite likely it may become the longest in American history if lawmakers don't reach a deal very soon. And what we're seeing, I think, is a shutdown that is clearly leading to consequences for Americans. We're beginning to see significant delays in flights due to air traffic controllers. We're seeing a number of government offices and facilities that are not available to citizens, seeing constraints on funding and availability of benefits for crucial supports such as SNAP, food stamps. And it's a significant impact on millions of Americans. So to begin, Kathy, what's your sense of what's driving this shutdown? Why are we not able to do something that seems so rudimentary and so basic, which is just to keep the government open? Why do we have to close the government at this time? And why can't we just keep the government open while politicians continue to debate their issues?
Well, first of all, we could if Congress would pass an automatic continuing resolution. That actually would be a long-term solution. And there have been bills introduced by people on each side of the aisle over the last however many years to try to put that kind of a mechanism in place. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you have to shut the government down when Congress can't agree on a budget. But that's a longer term issue. Let's talk about how we got where we are today. First of all, let's remember the House passed a continuing resolution bill in September, I think September 19th or so, before the October 1st deadline. And the House was able to do it because the Republicans who are in power have a majority. They have between a 3 and 8 vote majority, depending on who's there, who shows up. And also there's one Democrat who's been elected who's waiting to be sworn in. So the House was able to pass a continuing resolution. This issue now is in the Senate. And the vote to keep the government open the Senate has to pass this kind of a bill by 60 votes. There's a 45-55 split, 45 Democrats plus independents, 55 Republicans. So they needed one Republican, Rand Paul, voted no on the continuing resolution bill, and 3 Democrats voted yes. In essence, they need 5 people to switch their votes so that they can get to the 60 vote margin. That's technically why we are where we are today. The reasons behind what's going on there are multiple reasons. We faced this issue earlier, and Chuck Schumer decided that the Democrats were going to vote to keep the government open, and he got a lot of blowback. The House, actually, all the Democrats stayed in line and voted no, but in the Senate, Chuck Schumer got a couple of his members to vote to keep the government open so that the Senate was able to get to the 60 votes. He got so much blowback from constituents, frankly, from Democrats all across the country, who were furious that with everything that the Trump administration has been doing, breaking norms, challenging, doing things that many believe are illegal, cutting government agencies, cutting federal jobs. I mean, we could go through a whole list, but there was such blowback that I think this time around, Schumer decided he had to stand up to the Republicans. Remember, the Republicans control the House, the Senate, the executive branch with Trump, and some would say the Supreme Court. So right now, Democrats are fairly frustrated. They don't have any levers of power. The only power they have right now is to vote no on this continuing resolution. And by the way, the reason that we're here is because in order to pass the budget, there are 12 different appropriations bills that have to be passed. They aren't anywhere close to passing the 12 appropriations bills, so the only mechanism to use is this continuing resolution.
What do you see as the main substantive reasons that the Democrats are trying to use this moment as leverage? As you said, I think the Democrats were looking for a way to mobilize and to maintain a sense of resistance to the Trump administration. But nonetheless, I think they do have some substantive policy goals
There are
as well.
some very substantive policy goals. I think what happened last time when they were faced with shutting down the government was they hadn't reached agreement on what the critical issues were to shut down the government. There were so many of them, they had to focus on issues that they thought were critically important. In this time around, they have focused, number one, on the fact that there were premium subsidies put into place during COVID for people who get their insurance through the Affordable Care Act. And those subsidies expire at the end of the year. So that if those subsidies are not renewed, millions of people who get their health care through the Affordable Care Act are going to have to pay dramatically increased health insurance premiums. There were also some changes made so that hospitals are not receiving the same kind of reimbursement for certain uninsured and low-income patients. And as a result, we were already seeing hospitals in rural areas struggle. With these changes, we expect to see more rural hospitals shutting down. Those are the two big ones. The other thing that's happening right now with the government shutdown is SNAP benefits. Well, if you've been following the news, the Agriculture Department has emergency funds that they could use to keep SNAP benefits going, and those are supplemental food assistance. That's basically food stamps that 1 out of 8 Americans relies on to get food. Those are running out. There were a couple of lawsuits filed. The government has agreed to use the Agriculture Department's emergency fund to pay half the amount of those SNAP benefits. WIC benefits, women, infants, and children benefits, those are also at risk. Head Start funding is at risk. Those are the big ones that are at risk right now for people. That's the real impact on people. The other impact we're having right now with the shutdown is about 1.4 million federal workers are impacted right now. I think about 640,000 are furloughed and about 730,000 are working but without pay. And that has a real impact on people. A lot of people, as we know, live paycheck to paycheck. So if they're going to work and not getting paid, they may not be able to afford their child care. There are lots of other issues that are coming up. And when I was checking in for my flight today, I saw something in the paper that the airport is taking food and infant contributions to help the TSA workers who are working and the air traffic controllers who are working now without pay. We want to make sure that they have food to eat and have the supplies they need for their children.
Republicans, of course, are arguing, and it should be a familiar argument to Democrats because it's an argument that Democrats themselves have made in some past government shutdowns. They're saying, let's just have a clean bill, a clean CR, clean continuing resolution to keep the government funded. We shouldn't hold the American people hostage to our debate. We can have debates about ACA subsidies. We can discuss that. I think the House Speaker has said we can talk about those issues, but first fund the government. Why should the Democrats not agree to that and say, yes, we shouldn't have government workers that are skipping paychecks, that we shouldn't have people that are unable to use government services, keep the government funded, and then continue the debates. And that's really what the Republicans have been arguing.
So we're living in a time of such ugly partisanship that there is frankly no trust that the Republicans, once the CR is passed and the Democrats have no leverage, will actually negotiate in good faith over the issues that I just discussed. The other thing you have to remember is that at least when I was in Congress during the Biden administration, we worked so hard to pass legislation that we thought would have a huge benefit for the American people in a whole host of ways: healthcare, clean energy, increasing job training, reducing the cost of education. And little by little, this administration has used a variety of methods to undo a lot of the legislation that was passed. They've used that, what was called the One Big Beautiful Bill, which was the reconciliation package, to undo much of what was done. They've used a process called rescission to claw back funding that was allocated. And of course, the president is choosing not to spend money that was allocated in the prior administration for issues that Congress thought was really important. One other thing is being affected, of course, foreign aid, but public broadcasting, public radio. And if you live in an urban area, you don't really understand why, you may not understand why public broadcast is so important. In rural areas, that's a critically important source of news.
Yes, I think you put your finger on something important, which it seems to me that is an important background factor in this shutdown, which is the Democrats are not only trying to push to achieve policy goals like extending the AC subsidies, but they're saying, how can we negotiate in good faith with the Republicans and reach agreements about funding the government? If we even reach an agreement, the executive branch may simply rescind the money afterwards. And so we can't actually, we can't reach a deal until we actually have some guarantees. Now, it's not clear to me exactly how the administration would provide any guarantees given their past behavior. Let's say in a few days they decide to reach a deal. What kind of mechanism could the Democrats impose to ensure that these agreements, these funding bills, when they are in fact passed, whether it's continuing resolution or appropriations bills, that the money that Congress appropriates actually will be spent?
That's the $64 million question. What we've seen since this administration took over is time after time, Republicans in Congress who you would have thought would have taken a stand to vote against some of the bills that have been presented, some of the packages, have folded. And I mean, I'll give to me, what is the perfect example? And that was the vote to confirm RFK Jr. If you think that vaccines are important, if you think that having outbreaks of measles across this country are incredibly alarming when we thought we had eradicated that disease, if you think that autism is not caused by vaccines. In fact, that there's not scientific evidence that backs that up, you might wonder why so many Republicans, including one who was a physician who expressed doubt about whether he should vote for RFK Jr., why did they all fold in the end and vote to confirm somebody as the head of HHS who has unconventional ideas about public health? I'm trying to be bipartisan in the way, but I think that's a perfect example of where you thought this is the time that the Republicans are going to stand up and say this is a bridge too far, and yet they have completely failed to stand up to the president on almost everything. I'm drawing a blank on some time in the past 10 months when the Republicans have actually stood up and said no.
Although the president just the other day suggested perhaps the Senate should eliminate the filibuster.
Well, that is also very worrisome.
But the Republicans in the Senate don't seem to be willing to go along with that.
Well, that's the only time that I think they've stood up because they understand that power will change hands, and that a lot of Democrats will be looking, if there's no filibuster rule, to give back what they got.
Yeah, I'm wondering how much is in the minds of both Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill sort of lessons from past government shutdowns. Because if you look at history, look at several of the longest and most prominent shutdowns that we've had, the side that was trying to leverage the shutdown has usually not succeeded. So, for example, at least 3 cases back in the Clinton administration, 1995-96, this was following the arrival of the Newt Gingrich Congress, the first time the Republicans took over the House of Representatives since the 1950s. They were trying to shut down the government to bring about significant cuts in federal domestic spending in programs like Medicare and Medicaid, education, and the environment. And Bill Clinton famously stood firm in that, and he fought that effort, and his approval ratings ended up going much higher, and the Republicans didn't succeed very well with their effort to lever that shutdown. There was next an important long shutdown during the Obama administration, when the Republicans were trying to use a shutdown to get the Obama administration to repeal the Affordable Care Act in 2013. And they thought, we have the leverage, where finally they've been voting over and over again to try to eliminate this law that no Republican had voted for on passage. And they thought, this will give us some bargaining leverage. And of course, that one failed as well. And then during the first Trump administration, President Trump was trying to use a shutdown to get funding for his border wall. And that also failed. And so I'm just wondering, do you think this shutdown is different? Are the actors on Capitol Hill thinking about those lessons, or are they thinking the political context is quite changed? How do you think those the past episodes and the failure of, in those cases, Republicans, but to leverage shutdowns to advance their agenda, and their inability to do that is shaping the strategies of both sides today?
I think what the party in the minority is always worried about when they're trying to decide whether to shut down the government or whether not to vote to keep the government open, what they're always thinking about is who's going to get the blame. I mean, that is always the big issue. And I think that's really what Chuck Schumer was thinking about the first go round. He felt that the Democrats would be blamed, and that would, right now, if you look at public polls and how popular people are, the Democrats are not popular, the Republicans are not popular, the president is not popular. It's interesting. The only thing that people tend to like are their own representatives because they know them, because they actually get to meet with them and talk with them. And if a member of the House is doing their job when they're not in Washington right now, by the way, the only people who have been in Washington this whole time are the House Democrats. They have stayed in Washington. Does anybody know that they've been there? They've stayed because they're trying to make a point that they're ready, willing, and able to negotiate while President Trump was out of the country, while the Republicans have been home. But that's sort of theatrics. I don't know if the American people know that the Democrats have stayed in Washington ready, willing, and able to get to work and negotiate. So the issue is, who's going to get the blame? And right now what you're seeing is a messaging war going on. And there have been some incredible floor speeches that have been given. There have been some incredible press conferences. Some of my students are here. I'm delighted to see you, and you're going to see one of them tomorrow in class. But the problem is a lot of this is sort of inside baseball. I'm watching it because I want to see how my friends are doing back in Congress. But is the American public watching it? Most people don't have their TV stations tuned to C-SPAN. And so if you watch, for those people who even watch the news, they're only seeing what reporters decide is worthy of covering. And usually that's just the people who are screaming the loudest. It's not the people who are trying to, use common sense arguments about why their side is in the right.
So as a former member of Congress, maybe help us out, drill down a little bit. What do you think is going on in, say, a Democratic member of Congress right now? Maybe they're from a reasonably safe district. Are they hearing from constituents that are impacted? Are they hearing from constituents whose flight was delayed? Are they hearing from people who maybe are having trouble obtaining benefits? Are they hearing on the other side from some constituents saying, stay firm? What is the information that is flowing into that office, and how are they thinking about it?
I guarantee you they're hearing from everybody. And they're probably getting emails. They're probably getting letters. Their offices are probably getting lots of phone calls, and they're probably from people on both sides. The members of the House who are smart, when they're going back home, whether it's over the weekends, or I think they technically had a recess week where they might have gone home. If they're smart, they're out in their communities and they're meeting with people and they're trying to explain what's going on. And they're, when I had my recess weeks, and we avoided shutdowns, when you're home, you need to be out there meeting with your constituents wherever you can find them and being available to them. And that's really the best way to get the message out. They're probably doing local news interviews on local stations that people tend to watch. So they are hearing from people, but they're also trying to figure out how they can make their constituents understand what's really going on. And don't forget, every member of the House is up for re-election in 2026. So they really need to be out there talking to constituents and explaining why we're in the situation that we're in.
And in addition to those roles, the constituency outreach and the messaging and the media relations, do you think that any of the members of Congress are involved in other ways with trying to manage the negative impact of the shutdowns in their districts? Are they talking to their counterparts at the state and local level that might have services that are impacted?
That's a great point. Yes, they're probably meeting with their state government officials. They're probably talking to their governors. They're talking to the other state officials to find out, are there state funds, are there local funds that can be used to help people? Look, the big pitch that we've heard on the news over the last 2 weeks is that food banks are panicked, that they are going to be out of food. And I heard the CEO of Second Harvest, and they're a big operation in my former district, that they are deeply concerned that they're going to be running out of food. And that's a huge issue. And so, yes, they're probably finding out, are there local and state funds that can be used to help people who are really going to struggle over the next couple of weeks.
Assuming the shutdown goes on for a little bit longer, what do you think would lead significant members of the Democratic caucus in Congress to change their position on the shutdown and to say that the pain is simply too great for my constituents and we have to reach some kind of deal? What would be the factors that you think would tip some Democrats over? And then we could ask about on the other side as well.
The first thing that has to happen is we have to get through the election next Tuesday. Because, no, I'm serious, because next Tuesday, we're going to see not
this
just...
this Tuesday.
Oh, tomorrow. Sorry, I forgot what day it is.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, we have 3 big elections coming up. We have the New York City mayor, but even equally, if not more significant, we have the gubernatorial races in New Jersey and Virginia. And those will be seen as a bellwether for what's really happening across the country. For Virginia, very, very different environment than New York City. And so on one hand, we have two women running for governor. I serve with both of them. They're terrific, and they are very moderate, common sense Democrats. In the New York mayor's race, we have a very different set of candidates. And I think the Democrats are going to be looking to see what happens. And they don't want to depress voter turnout for tomorrow. So first we need to get through tomorrow and see what if anything, do we learn from that? After that, I heard that there are meetings going on with leadership and certain key members on both sides of the aisle. Mm-hmm. And there are there are a couple of Democrats who are from very conservative areas, who are probably pushing hard to find a resolution to get the government back open. And there probably are people who are pushing Republican leadership to make some kind of a deal, because even the president has said he doesn't want people to lose their health care. So maybe what they could come, you said we're going to at some point get to what I think the solutions might be. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the solutions are going to be, but right now, the CR that they're talking about only goes to November 21st. That is fast approaching. That means that they're going to be in this fight all over again on November 21st, and everybody wants to go home for Thanksgiving. So maybe one solution would be to come up with a longer CR with some guarantees, maybe a short-term resumption of the ACA premium subsidies, and some kind of mechanism to make sure that there's food for SNAP and WIC. The other thing I think I mentioned, heating assistance for low-income individuals. But maybe we can have some kind of a short-term guarantee just to get us. I mean, you don't want to say till right before Christmas, because then you're in the same fight over Christmas. Maybe right after the beginning of the year.
So I think most people's assumption, certainly my assumption, had been that at some point there will be a negotiated agreement, and there'll be some agreement about the ACA subsidies and some of the other programs. But just recently, there's been another possibility that's been raised, and I'm curious whether you think we should consider it seriously. And that is whether President Trump could unilaterally end the shutdown. And so the reason why the government is shut down is because of an interpretation of law that the Anti-Deficiency Act does not allow the government to continue operating without the passage of a continuing resolution or these appropriation bills. But that interpretation only apparently dates back to the Carter administration in the early 1980s. And there's been some talk about the fact that a president might be able to say, we can keep the government open just at a lower level of spending, or that we could declare all workers are essential, or there could be various ways of saying that the Anti-Deficiency Act does not necessarily require a shutdown and a new interpretation of that law, because prior to 1980, there hadn't been the understanding that the failure to pass appropriation bills meant that the government had to altogether shut down. So is that actually a live possibility?
I certainly don't doubt that President Trump would be willing to buy into some new and different interpretation of existing law. But I think we have to make sure that he's actually ready to pay attention to it, because he's been busy over the past couple of weeks. He's been tearing apart the White House. He's been traveling all over the world, creating peace everywhere. And so what he would need to do is actually focus on this particular issue, and he'd have to take responsibility. Right now, he doesn't mind that agencies are being shut down, because many of the agencies are actually preparing to fire additional numbers of federal workers. Mm-hmm. And that's been part of
reduction in force.
Thank you. That's been part of his plan from the beginning. So I don't think he's been bothered by what's going on, and he certainly hasn't wanted to be involved in the negotiations. Maybe now that he's returned, and I think he actually was in Mar-a-Lago this weekend. So if he's back in Washington and they can get him to focus on this issue, maybe he would be willing to buy into this new interpretation of that law. Yeah. But I think the other issue that we haven't really talked about is even if the Republicans and the Democrats in the Senate can reach some kind of agreement, they have to reach an agreement that President Trump is willing to sign. And until they get their instructions from him, they are not sure what he's willing to sign. So I'm a little skeptical, but I think he has to hear that enough people are upset. In Mar-a-Lago, I don't think he's seeing people who are concerned about their SNAP benefits and their WIC benefits. But now that when he's back in Washington, he may get pressure from when we start to see leaders traveling to the White House for meetings. Then we'll know that he's engaged in these discussions and that there might be some kind of a plan being put in place.
The other thing that makes, I think, this shutdown so distinctive is the degree to which the administration has found ways of protecting certain constituencies during the shutdown while allowing others to feel the brunt. So the military, for example, he's found very novel ways. He's
got a donor who gave a significant amount of money, but in my class, we discovered that actually only amounted to $100 per service member. So it wasn't really the benefit that he thought. But yeah, he's got people coming in and donating.
He's moved money around too.
He's moved money around. He has.
Yes. And so that is a different dynamic of if a president is able to use a shutdown in partisan ways or to protect particular constituencies, the bargaining dynamics might change a lot because one side may begin to feel more pain than the other side.
That's true.
Yeah. So,
but we do also have the impact of the courts. Yes. I mean, there are some courts that have stepped up and said that I think a court here in Rhode Island and a court in Massachusetts that said on SNAP, you have to, this is an emergency. That's what the emergency funds are there for. You have to use that fund.
Although I gather today, the administration is saying they're only going to pay partial SNAP benefits in November.
They're going to fight every step of the way.
Yeah. So before we open it up for questions, I guess, what do you see as this shutdown will end at some point, but it will create a legacy. And how do you see this shutdown and the dynamics that we're observing as affecting congressional presidential relations going forward, or the public's trust in government, or the two parties? What are going to be the broader ramifications of the shutdown even after it ends?
Boy, that's a tough question. If the Democrats are able to get even a short-term extension of the ACA subsidies, I think they will be able to say, this was worth it. This was the only way we could negotiate with this Congress and this administration to do something that's critically important to millions of Americans. If they don't end up getting anything, I think we'll see it reflected in the midterm elections in 2026. Now, we don't know what's going to happen in 2026 because right now we've got a gerrymandering contest that's going on. Which states can do the most gerrymandering? And so that's we don't even know what to predict for what's going to happen in 2026. But the outcome of this shutdown, I think, could have an impact on the midterm elections. In terms of, is this going to help relationships between Congress and the administration? No. I mean, I certainly don't think it's going to help. The bigger issue is how are Republicans and Democrats in Congress going to work together in the future? I mean, I was there for the insurrection, and things were really, really tense for the probably 6 months after the insurrection, where so many Democrats just couldn't believe that Republicans, after we were caught for so many hours, went back to the House floor and continued to dispute the fairness of the election. And it took a while to get over that. I actually think that was a major breach of trust, that people who had been working together across the aisle for years all of a sudden wondered, how could they work with those people? And a lot of the people who worked in the most bipartisan way, particularly on the Republican side, have retired. The big question is, once we get through this, is there a way to rebuild good working relationships between Republicans and Democrats in the House and in the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, I think on that point, what has been very striking to me in the shutdown is that some of the senators, for example, that have typically been the ones that have most reached across the aisle, have been less willing to do so because of the erosion of trust. So people like Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, I think there's a gang of sort of Democrats and Republicans. He's always been part of it. He's always been wanting to reach across the aisle. But
he may also not want to do anything that's going to impact, don't forget, he's from Virginia.
Election.
The Virginia governor's election.
But for example, there was recently a foreign policy briefing that the White House did that only invited Republican senators, and the Democratic senators were not invited. And that really was a change from past practice. And those kinds of erosion of bipartisan comity really, I think, makes it much harder to overcome these kinds of obstacles. There's always going to be members from both sides that are from very blue districts, very red districts, but you need some that are sort of willing to talk to the other side. But if they too lose trust and believe that there won't be good faith bargaining, this becomes much harder to resolve.
And you might recall that Senator Warner was supposed to go to a briefing that he had set up, either at the Pentagon or one. I can't remember where it was. He was going to have he's on the intelligence committee. He was going to have a briefing and was told he was disinvited, and that came from the administration.
Yeah. Great. So I think we have some time for some questions. Thea will walk around with a mic. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Oh, yes.
Thank you. The word negotiate keeps coming up, and yet it sounds to me more like demands. I demand that you give me this. Have you any comments about what would constitute negotiations?
Well, that's interesting. I think if the people who are representing their parties can sit in a room and in good faith talk about things that are deeply important to their constituents and reach some kind of a compromise, that would be a negotiation.
There has been at least some discussion, I think, of perhaps a willingness among some Democrats to consider less than full extension of the ACA premium subsidies. Some of those subsidies go to people that are relatively more affluent than others. I think at least some Democrats were perhaps at least willing to discuss that perhaps some of these subsidies should be extended, but maybe not all of them. That was one area that I had heard that might be on the table for a conversation.
I mean, that would make sense. That's the kind of a compromise that would make sense. I think what you're going to see over time is that Democrats who are in tough seats, who are in the seats, what they call frontline seats that have a broader mix of Democrats and Republicans, or in seats that Trump won, they're going to be putting more pressure on leadership to resolve this, particularly in the House, because they've got to run for re-election. So those are the people who are more likely to be pushing House leadership to try to work with their Senate colleagues to try to come up with some kind of a compromise.
Other questions?
Yes. Given how important older voters are in the voting blocks of both parties, and given that they are overall more affected by the government shutdown than younger voters, could you speculate on which party might be hurt more in the aftermath of this?
I don't know that. I don't think older voters vote in a block. So I don't think everybody over, I won't call old 80 and over. I don't know that they all vote the same way. I know that there are certain issues that, if you saw in Biden's second State of the Union, he actually negotiated with the Republicans during that State of the Union about whether to roll back Medicare. And so there are certain issues that older voters care more deeply about, but I don't think older voters vote as a Republican bloc or a Democratic bloc. I think you look more to what area they live in and what their big issues are. I don't know that I can't guess as to which party that's going to impact more. I mean, I think where you have areas where there are lots of people who are on SNAP benefits or on the kinds of benefits that are being hurt, I think you might see that impacts the Republicans. Areas where there are lots of federal workers who are impacted by being furloughed or being let go. It's just hard to tell. Going back to what I said earlier, it's a messaging game right now. And do people think that the Democrats are right not to give on some of these issues? Or do people think no matter what, you should never shut the government down and the Democrats are wrong? I don't know what the answer is right now.
Hi, I was just wondering, because I know you mentioned the role of the courts in the recent federal court decisions that just came out. And I know there's been a lot of different cases with federal courts and fights against the Trump administration, and there's been like varying effects. So can you talk a little more about what you see the impact, like the role of the federal courts specifically in the government shutdown, and if you think there's going to be any effects of decisions that they make, or if there's anything more they can do since they're not directly affected by like constituent viewpoints?
Well, I think ultimately some of these issues are going to get to the Supreme Court, and we've seen a lot of the cases that have been brought over. Oops, I guess we're done.
The government shutdown comes to us.
I think there's a decision coming up on tariffs right now that I think will have a big impact. It's not directly related to the government. It's not related to the government shutdown, but will the Supreme Court stand up to the administration on tariffs? And if so, will that cause the administration to pull back a little bit and try to adhere to existing law? We don't know. We just saw the president break off relations with Canada because of an ad they put on the airwaves quoting Ronald Reagan, who was actually not a proponent of tariffs. So we don't know if a decision against him in the Supreme Court would cause him to dig in his heels or maybe pull back in the way he's been behaving. So I think we're going to see, as different cases come up, we're going to see different district courts rule against what the administration is doing. But when it gets to the Supreme Court, we really have no way of predicting what's going on. In fact, there was a big article in one of the papers over the weekend saying that the three more liberal women are having a lot of anxiety over whether they should abide by the "be nice to your colleagues" rule in the dissent, or whether whether they're going to break the glass movement and they need to be more aggressive in the way they talk about their colleagues' decisions. So you might say the Supreme Court is in crisis right now also.
What do you think are the key takeaways for states in the event that a shutdown like this were to occur in the future, especially in terms of the ACA marketplace and SNAP benefits? And what are sort of the guardrails that states can implement to make sure that in an event of another long shutdown, they can protect their own residents and they're not as impacted?
Thank you. I'll talk about North Carolina and I'll let you talk more generally. In North Carolina, we have a rainy day fund that is basically an emergency fund where tax dollars are put in this particular fund so that when there are emergencies that hit the state, there is some funding. Unfortunately, there's probably not enough in our state's rainy day fund to make up for all the federal funding that's being lost. But down the road, states may decide it's critically important to have those funds and maybe save more along the way in case of future emergencies.
I mean, I think it's easy to lose the big picture when we're in the moment and we're dealing with a particular crisis of the shutdown. But if you look at the big picture, and we don't know where things are going to end, but it is possible we're at a moment of significant reconfiguration of the relationship of the federal government to the states. We've already saw with the passage of the big, beautiful bill, significant cutbacks in social spending. We're projected to have a decline in the health insurance rate in the United States as a result of some of those changes. We're seeing the imposition of Medicaid work requirements, perhaps cutbacks in SNAP as well that were contained in the bill. And so at the state and local level, I think there'd been an assumption that the federal government was providing a certain level of public social provision. And the states and localities were planning their programs around that expectation. That expectation now may be changing. Whether that change is durable or not, we don't know. But there's a possibility there will be a significant reduction in federal social provision. At the same time, we're also seeing, I think, with these yet to be decided Supreme Court cases on appropriations and entitlements and rescissions, but it's possible a change in the balance of power over spending between Congress and the executive. And if that were to happen in important ways, that too would be a major institutional factor that states and localities are going to have to take into account. So we're in a moment, I think, of a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of discussion about, are we seeing democratic backsliding? Is this in some ways outside of trade and immigration just a return to Ronald Reagan economics? Or are we seeing in some ways a new constitutional moment where the very basics of how our institutions operate, how does Congress operate, how does the president operate, what is the relationship with the federal government and the states, is also perhaps being changed. And I don't yet know how those are going to be resolved, but when we're at the other side of this in a few years, it's possible we'll look back and say this was a period of substantial change in American governance. And if that were to occur, that's going to require actors at the state and local levels to adapt to that change.
Hi. So we've talked a bit about the messaging of it all and how aggressive should you be or can you be in this time. I'm wondering, and I have most perspective into New York, since where I came before this program, but we've seen in New York how in many ways Zohran Mamdani's candidacy has pushed, whether intentionally or not, the Democratic Party in New York overall to shift a bit to the left. And so I'm wondering, in the lead up to the midterm elections, like how you see the Democratic Party either trying to coalesce maybe in a more aggressive way against like potential threats of what could happen in the midterm election, or do you think that this isn't the time necessarily to make bolder proclamations of the stakes that we're facing today?
So one of the things that I learned when I was in Congress was that 435 representatives represent vastly different districts. And the things that were really important to the people who live in my district were so different from the districts of people, somebody in Arizona, somebody in Washington State. I mean, there are different business environments, there are different populations, there are different education levels. The districts really are very, very different. So what works in New York City, in a densely urban area, is going to be very different than what works in a district like mine in the middle of North Carolina, or a district in Michigan where they've got some big, they've got an interesting Senate race going on, or a district in California. And so I think we will have more candidates who emulate what Mamdani is doing, but I don't think it will be vastly across the country. And I think what we talked about so often in Congress was the majority makers are those who are in difficult districts. It's not the people who are in the deep blue districts. It's those who win those really tough seats. And it's hard to know the message, the economic message that Mamdani has talked about of the fact that people are struggling to get by, that message resonates.
That's what I mean.
That message, absolutely. It's always about the economy. The question is he going to be able to implement the proposals that he has talked about in his campaign?
I mean, the other factor, I agree with everything you said about how different the districts are, and candidates want to tailor themselves to the needs and preferences of those districts. But at the same time, our politics has become much more nationalized than it was 50 years ago. There really are Democratic brands and Republican brands, and it has become harder for candidates of both parties to differentiate themselves from the party brand. And so if you are a more moderate Democrat, you can be sure that Republicans are going to try to paint you as believing in the same things as a Democrat from a more blue constituency. That's become, I think, a big challenge for candidates.
I think we always, when we're running for office, are talking about the economy because that's what people care about. But we can agree that we want everybody to have an opportunity to have a good paying job so they can support their family. The question is, what does that mean? And in different districts, I think it means different things.
Great.
You've been talking about
Over them.
Thank you. You've been talking about if I could sort of summarize a sort of bipartisan mechanism where candidates who feel that their election will be contested are pressured to compromise and to reach that sort of bipartisan consensus position. And I guess I'm wondering, as the year's drawing to a close, what do you think bipartisanship even looks like in 2026? Like, the people you're pointing to as being the drivers of change in this moment are people who are on these frontline seats who are going to have contested elections. I'm not sure I know or could predict who those people would be in 2026 if the gerrymanders go through, if the Voting Rights Act is overturned. Like, I feel like there's a way in which the predictability of what the center looks like has changed. And I don't know what your opinion on that is.
I totally agree with you. Look, the extreme gerrymandering is changing the nature of how our elections turn out. And in my area, I was gerrymandered up. That's why I'm here today. And
we're glad you are.
Well, thank you very much. My husband is glad also. I don't know about my constituents, but I had a guy as I was getting off the plane today who I didn't know on the plane walk by and say, "I'm really sorry I didn't get to vote for you again. Thank you for what you did." So I feel like in my district, I was a good representative from my district. But they tore my district into 3 different pieces, and each piece was attached to far-flung rural areas. That is a real problem all across the country because more and more people feel like they're not being represented because when you gerrymander, it is more likely that you're going to get candidates who pander to those who vote in the primaries, and they don't have to move toward the center to try to get votes of Republicans, Democrats, and independents. That's the real problem with gerrymandering is it's only going to make the partisanship worse.
Any other questions? Oh, that'd be good. One of the babies.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. At the graduation weekend in May, I attended this fine institution, which was not here when I was a student, but it's been decades. Professor Schiller presided that day. And at the end of the gathering, she said a few words which sounded like there may be a rumor afoot in Congress to the effect that the Supreme Court doesn't want an issue to reach it of the sort that it might gather 5 good votes, including from Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett, in addition to the 3 good women, because there's a fear that if such an issue did reach the court and gathered 5 votes, that Trump would not obey the order.
That has been a rumor for many, many months, just like the rumor that he's going to run again in 2028. And I think his unpredictability is part of his brand. I thought where you were going was that the justices fear for their lives, because that's another issue that we see all across the country. And Lisa Murkowski was quite open about it when she said, somebody asked her about fear are members of Congress actually afraid of what could happen to them? And she said, we're all afraid. And I can tell you, when I've had conversations with, I had many friends on the other side of the aisle when I was in Congress. And because I was on Foreign Affairs Committee, I traveled a great deal with bipartisan groups. And I had several members of Congress tell me that they get daily death threats, that their families get threatened. So there's a lot of fear out there that motivates the way some members of Congress behave. But as to, is there a fear that Trump might not obey the Supreme Court rulings? I think there is a fear, because I think his unpredictability he views as one of his greatest tools.
I mean, so far, I think the Solicitor General had a famous colloquy at the Supreme Court about whether they would obey, and indicated they would. And it's clearly in the administration's interest to work with the Supreme Court, because on many, many issues, the Supreme Court conservative supermajority is quite aligned with the administration. And it's a tremendous asset for the administration, and adds legitimacy to the direction they're taking. And so there's been a lot of tension between the Supreme Court and the lower courts. And it is possible that the Supreme Court is treading very cautiously about what rulings they're making for fear of this. But on the other hand, the administration does have an incentive to maintain positive relations with the Supreme Court, even if they lose in a case or two, because in many, many issues they are winning.
But we are seeing more of, what do they call it, the shadow document?
Yes, we don't have the final rulings yet.
Right. Where these decisions are being made in the dark of night with no explanation.
And they're not on the merits yet, they're provisional rulings.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that the court is doing is making their decisions on the narrowest basis possible in almost all of the most controversial decisions, other than the Dobbs case.
Yeah, we have a lot of important Supreme Court decisions coming up soon, and that will really have a major impact on this Trump administration, which way they go.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk today. It's been wonderful. My question is about the theory that's been thrown around a little bit in Democratic circles about soft succession and blue states withholding certain taxpayer dollars in funding. I was wondering, how should Congress respond if that does happen? And do you think these threats are legitimate and deserve merit and concern with the direction the Trump administration's going?
I am not a secessionist. I do not believe that we should have a soft civil war, which is sort of what that sounds like. I think that would be first of all, I've never heard that rumor before, so thank you for bringing me getting me in the know. I think that would be a disaster for the state of our union. And by the way, we had a talk. Just hold on one second. Before I left Congress, Doris Kearns Goodwin came in and spoke to a group of Democrats. This was after the election. The historian. She's a very famous presidential historian, and she spoke with a group of Democratic members of Congress. And she said, "I want to try to put this moment in perspective, because it was after the election. We were all very anxious about what we would be seeing during this." I don't think anybody could have anticipated what we've seen over the last 10 months. But what she did say was, this country has been through more difficult times. And she went through a variety of presidents and issues they had faced, some that I had forgotten about, some that maybe I didn't even know about. But she was a little bit reassuring to say that this country has had terrible challenges in the past, and the American people have always managed to pull together. So she gave us all a feeling of hope. Sorry.
All right, thank you so much. So I find it very interesting what Professor Patashnik said about the people who start shutdowns not usually getting what they want. So I'm wondering whether it's possible in theory. So, for example, in this case, even if the Democrats doesn't get what they want, like in the immediate term, whether it gives like this reputation to the Republicans that we're tough, the Democrats are tough, and then that like eases like negotiations or interactions in the future. I'm wondering whether that's a likely scenario.
I mean, it's a great theory. It would be a nice byproduct of what's happened. I think it'll all depend on in the end how soon this ends and how much damage is actually done. Because it's good to be known as a tough negotiator, but if you destroy what you were trying to save in the negotiation, I don't think it's going to help your reputation.
And the context is very different, but there is a difference in the policy substance as well between Republicans that were trying to use shutdowns as leverage to reduce social benefits versus Democrats that are trying to use a shutdown to protect social benefits. And so we'll have to see how important that factor is, but they're not quite symmetric. And so I want to thank Kathy Manning for a great conversation and everyone for coming.